So we really just talked about the main components of the GCS, so the hardware and firmware, and really what I want to do is just sort of break down sort of the hardware into its individual components. So what are all the components that are in every GCS? So regardless of whether that GCS is for 3D Air Solo or Global Hawk, it's most likely going to have these primary components. We're talking about what are the primary hardware components of a GCS. What I mean is what components are required. All right, so every ground control system needs to have power. Every ground control system needs to have some way to control the aircraft. Every ground control system needs some way for the user to interface with the output so that we know, I understand what information is coming from the aircraft. And then aircraft controls basically is saying that I need to have some way to send information to the aircraft. Right? Every ground control system needs a computer because as we are seeing, so this is, I guess probably a big, maybe this is the big distinction between a UAS and an RC vehicle, where every UAS really needs a computer because the aircraft itself has these onboard components that are making a lot of decisions, and so we need something on board to interact with those components to make some decisions to figure out what information are we going to send back down to the ground control system. So every ground control system needs to have a computer. To send that information, every ground control system needs to have a radio. And then I'm going to make this distinction between a radio and an antenna. And the reason I do this is primarily, as we'll see, there are other ways to communicate between the GCS and an aircraft other than radio communications. But an antenna, I'm going to say, is the physical device that allows for communication between the radio on board the aircraft and the radio on board the GCS. All right, so let's dive in and take a little bit more of a detailed look at each of these components. So our power is usually going to be a battery power, but depending on what our GCS is, our GCS could be a laptop, for example, or even a desktop computer if possible. Right, and so if we're using a desktop specifically or even a laptop, then our power source for our ground control system is going to be beyond just a simple battery. All right, so in that case, our ground control system is powered by AC power. It's the kind of thing we can plug into a wall, have some sort of power supply. All right, so our power is going to be something independent of the overall system. Usually it's going to be a battery, and the example with the 3D Air Solo, if you can see that on the back of the GCS, is a little battery right here. It's just a lithium polymer battery, and I can plug a charger right into the port of the side of the GCS, and that will charge that independent battery. So independent power source, it's usually going to be a battery, but our GCS can be powered by AC power that comes from a generator, comes from an outlet, whatever that AC power source is going to be. Okay. All right, then our aircraft controls, we have to have some way to control the aircraft from our ground control system. The simplest control you can consider are the sticks, right? Wiggling the sticks. I have my acceleration, deceleration, pitch, yaw, roll. I can control the camera, a gimbaled camera with different controls. So I know this is tiny for you guys. I'm just showing you as an example, but so we have this the stick wiggle option. But I also, so the little controls on the back of the 3DR Solo controller, this allows me to control my where my camera is pointing. So my sensor itself, I can control the pitch of my gimbal and control that sensor. So this hands-on throttle and stick, this probably is more relevant for some of you in this class than it is for me. Basically, this is the HOTAS, or however you say it. This basically is simulating sort of a aircraft, more realistic aircraft control. And I have a photo down below of a HOTAS system. But, that's going to allow us to sort of have a more realistic interaction with the aircraft. Now, I have flown UAS that really just has, well, I guess the latest example that I've used, so the Latitude UAS is a large UAS. It's like, it's the unmanned aircraft system I worked with earlier when I was down on the Bighorn Fire in Tucson, Arizona. And that system doesn't have a hand controller. That system is controlled through a computer interface where you're just clicking buttons and you're giving commands. The aircraft is interpreting those commands to launch and land and hover and loiter, for example. But really what we're just using are buttons and controls that are interpreted through the GCS to tell the aircraft to do certain things. So that system is odd, where it doesn't even have a way to manually fly the aircraft. And actually, I did talk to the operator, because there is an option to install one. And this is a total sidebar, but for your institutional knowledge, that the operator of his system who built the system is like, well, what he did is he went back and analyzed all the mishaps on the aircraft, and out of the total of like 30 mishaps that occurred with this particular aircraft, he found something like 2 of them could have been avoided if they did have sticks to wiggle to actually take control of the aircraft. It's possible they could have avoided 2 of those mishaps, and about 18 of those mishaps happened because of human error, because a human was operating the aircraft and actually flew it into bad terrain. So in this case, the vendor made the decision to not install the stick wiggling interface on that aircraft, just because he knew he wasn't going to be the one flying every time, and sort of minimize that chance for human error. And as hopefully, we'll discuss this when we talk about the human factor of UAS, but hopefully you guys are getting a good dose of it in your aviation program. But humans are by far, we're the most dynamic, most important, and most useful component of a UAS. We're also the most error prone. Typically, this hardware, software, these computers don't really make mistakes. What they do is often we give information that we don't understand exactly how the computer is going to interpret the information we provide. And but typically, when we're having aviation failures, typically it's human factors. Through our computer interface and the functional inputs of our autopilot and our flight controller, that can actually we can make decisions that allow those two components to sort of control where the aircraft, to control the aircraft. Okay, so user interface, UI. And I think I skipped over it, but in the previous slide, I sort of outlined UI, UX. So UI, UX is just a term for user interface, user experience. And really what it describes is, you know, how it's that human-machine interface. How am I interpreting the information that the GCS is providing to me? So really the UI, so the UI output device in my 3DR Solo example, we have, in the Solo example, we actually have two output devices. We have the iPad, which we can fly without the iPad. The GCS functions 100% without the iPad. We just don't have any way, without the iPad within this specific ground control system, we don't have any way to receive the video stream. Right, so the video stream through the Solo is only going to come into the iPad. But if we remove the iPad from this ground control system, we still have the user interface that exists within this small display window, which is pretty cool. So if I think about some aircraft that y'all might be familiar with, the DJI aircraft. So the DJI Mavic Pro has a little user interface on the ground control system, but like the Mavic Mini, the M600, the Phantom Pro, those ground control systems do not have a user interface, output user interface. So I take that back. So there are some user interface components of that GCS, but it's far more limited, right? And so this is a great example. The only like thinking about the M600, the Matrice 600, which is a very large, small UAS, but so the output user interface on that controller consists of a 4-bar LED that tells the operator what the battery levels are, and then some sound, right? So there's actually a speaker and a soundboard on that GCS. So I get basically I get emergency alerts. So when that aircraft enters return to home, or when it's about to enter return to home, I get a verbal warning, right? And so for that GCS, those are the only user interface components there. With the Solo, I do have the sound, I do have the little board, and then if I add the iPad, I have that interface as well. We also are going to have onboard computer, which basically is going to store information, interpret the information, and provide that information to the user interface. All right, so I do want to take a second and talk about radio communication, all right? And I use the term radio as a sort of symbolic for many UAS, particularly any UAS we're going to operate line of sight or visual line of sight. We're going to use that true radio frequency communication where I am truly sending some communication from these antennas to the aircraft. The aircraft is communicating through its antennas back to the ground control station. All right, let me just pull out the Solo here, and so I know this is really small, but so 3DR Solo, you're looking at it top down. If you're looking at it from the side, we have the nose to my right, I guess that'd be your left, and then the tail to your left, your right, my left. And then underneath, looking at, you're looking at the bottom of the aircraft, we have the payload in the front at the nose of the aircraft, And then radio communications, the radio antenna is actually at the tail of the aircraft, right? And we'll talk a little bit more specifically when we get into human factors, a human element. But we always want to be flying nose out, right? So if you're the operator, the aircraft is always going to be flying with that aircraft nose out. That way, when you say, I'm going to roll forward, or sorry, when I'm going to pitch forward, that stick movement is intuitive, right? I'm pushing forward, the aircraft is moving out and away. Now, as soon as I come nose in, those commands become opposite. My only point is the radio communications are going to be in the back of the aircraft because that should be the best line of sight between you, the ground control station, and the aircraft. All right, so let's see. So radios are responsible for the data coming in and going out of the aircraft. Hopefully that's very crystal clear by now. So for a typical radio to communicate, it has to be line of sight. Okay, so as soon as, other than DJI, which has like this amazing form of communication with their UAS, if I'm trying to talk to my solo and my solo goes behind a dense canopy of trees, I'm going to lose that communication. That has a lot to do with the radio frequency that my 3DR solo radio communication is using. This is using a 2.4 gigahertz radio communication, which is a pretty high frequency. It's a high energy. It's a short wavelength. And what we'll see is the longer the wavelength of our communications, the more those radio waves can penetrate obstacles, such as trees, or go around obstacles such as a mountain range, or go through dense media like thick smoke or fog. That kind of stuff, even smoke and fog can provide a pretty big obstacle to high energy radio frequencies such as 2.4 gigahertz. You know, so what that means is how many gigahertz is how many frequencies per second, are how many times a wavelength flashes in a second. And so 900 megahertz is basically saying the radio wave is 900 million wavelengths per second, where a gigahertz is saying it's 2.4 billion. All right, so it's a lot. It's an entire order of magnitude higher radio frequency. And the only thing I want you to realize is that a higher radio frequency has advantages, like it allows us to do sophisticated tasks like frequency hops, so I can add encryption to my connection, so that if I have 3, 4, 5 3DR solos all operating at the 2.4 gigahertz level, each solo is actually encrypted so that one ground control system talks to one aircraft. All right, so even though I might have several ground control stations using systems using the same frequency, each one of those frequencies has a unique encryption that allows it to talk to a specific aircraft. All right, I think I really covered most of what's in here. I'll point out that, I with the 3DR Solo, our user interface is the tablet, right? So I can see my video on the tablet, but something a lot of drone operators use are first-person goggles, right? And I love this. I love this image of this dude flying his probably his racing quad in the park, but he's got a set of FPV goggles on, and I just want to point out, so this image really conjures a couple examples that I've talked about already today, and that is that, you know, one is our command and control, our C2, is going to be on a different radio link than our video, right? And if you think about the first-person goggles, and I want you, when you think about that statement I just said, I want you to think about this picture. Think about this dude. He's got his first-person goggles on, and look at this thing on his forehead, right? He's got a battery source strapped to the side of his head. He's got a radio antenna strapped to the top of his head, and he's got his first-person goggles strapped over his eyes. So basically, think of his head as the user interface. This battery is powering the user interface of his goggles. The goggles are connected to an independent radio that's on board the aircraft. So these FPV goggles are actually communicating through a 5.8 gigahertz frequency, completely independent of the C2. The command and control is coming from everything in his hands right here, right? So you see, we can see a separate battery pack strapped to the back of his GCS. We can see a large antenna coming off the GCS. So this is how he's communicating with the aircraft to control that aircraft, where his video stream is completely independent, completely different antenna, and just completely independent of the command and control. All right. So the longer the frequency, the better our chance is for communicating over a long range, right? So when we're talking about megahertz, that's a lot longer of a frequency than a gigahertz. All right, so besides radio communications, there are lots of other forms of communications that we can use to link between our GCS and our aircraft. All right, so when we're talking about large UAS, such as like the Global Hawk or Predator, or really, you know, any sort of UAS that we're going to fly really long-range missions, anytime we're going beyond visual line of sight or beyond the typical range of radio communications, which really maxes out at about 5 miles, 5 to 10 miles for these handheld units, then we have to use something like satellite link communications. Oh, there it is. I actually have. And that link right there, instead of waiting for that to load up, you guys can check this out, but that link is going to take you to this company, Galat, and I encourage you to check it out. Like, so this is basically a little satellite communication system that you can buy and put on your home-built large UAS. I wouldn't go trying to put this on a DJI because it looks like it probably weighs about 50 pounds, which is more than the aircraft itself. But if you wanted to build a large UAS that you wanted to fly and control with satellite, and once you get your waiver from the FAA, you could buy your satellite communications, strap that on, and communicate with your UAS. All right, but there are other forms of communication between components in the GCS. So Bluetooth is very commonly used to attach other devices to GCS. In Hawaii, when we flew an M600 with a gas sensor on it, and the part of the GCS there was a laptop computer, and so that sensor was actually connected via Bluetooth to the laptop, And so you would fly that sensor out and on the aircraft, and it's collecting information as it's flying. And then as we're flying that aircraft in, before we actually even landed, that the Bluetooth would connect and transmit that data. So we actually could start analyzing that data before the aircraft was actually on the ground. And then Wi-Fi is also used to connect components. And the great example there is, as I mentioned, the 3DR Solo connector, where the user interface tablet is actually connected to the human-machine interface through Wi-Fi. All right, then this separate component antenna. I think we've seen a few different antennas, so I don't need to beat that into your heads anymore. All right, so those are the primary components. Again, this table summarizes the components that must be part of the GCS. Next, I want to just talk about, and this is sort of just things to think about, consider, because in no way am I presenting an exhaustive list of alternative components for a ground control station or system. What I'm listing here is just some of the things I've used, I've seen in my experience, but as we'll sort of see towards the bottom of this little section, a ground control system can be very complex and have many different components as part of it. So we can have additional components for operator interface. So we can have custom components like we're seeing in this image with the quad racer guy here. We can have components like tables, chairs, a tent, something to give us shade. Maybe we just have a towel over our heads. If I'm out in the sunlight and I'm trying to see my display, just throwing a towel over my head and the ground control system might be a very important component that allows me to actually see the ground control station. The seat of a car, you can think about that as sort of a cockpit or alternative component to the GCS. As long as the car isn't moving according to Part 107 rules. Lawn chair, top of a 70-foot tower. What the hell am I talking about there? I'll get to what I'm talking about in a second. But some other alternative GCS components like a global positioning system. And this is common with small UAS. With the 3DR Solo, what it does is it actually uses the location of the tablet. So it uses the GPS location on the tablet to say what is the location of the ground control station or system. But like the DJI Mavic Pro, for example, there is an independent GPS within the hand controller itself. So it has a GPS on board the hand controller. So the really convenient thing there is, if I want to return to home, the aircraft, as long as GPS is not jammed for some reason, my aircraft is always going to be able to navigate back to where my location is. All right, so audio feedback, and I've talked a little bit about that. A lot of hand controllers are going to use some audio to communicate with the operator. Payload, data link, or data storage. This actually happens. I think I mentioned it last week when I was talking about when I'm flying my 3DR Solo. If I'm using my phone as my ground control, as part of my ground control system, as I'm taking photos with that, with my DJI Mavic Pro, those images as I'm connecting are downloading to my phone. So it's actually storing that information on that payload information onto my phone. All right, so I'm not going to get to talk about. Well, maybe let's see here. All I have at the bottom of this section are just some images of some ground control stations or ground control systems that I've been a part of in the past, all right? And I just want to point this out just to sort of open your minds about, you know, what to think about when you're considering what is a ground control system or a station, right? And what I want to point out here is this is I'm actually in this photo, I'm on top of the 70-foot tower. Maybe I'm not, maybe I took this photo, but I was up there at some point. But this is in Anchorage, Alaska, and this is actually at an airfield, which was the only, if anyone has spent much time in Alaska, you know that Alaska is too big to drive many places. Everyone flies everywhere. So the only place we actually could get clearance is at this airfield. And so we could fly up to about 300 feet AGL. But what we found was this whole area is surrounded by trees. So when you're flying from the ground, even if you can see the aircraft, you really cannot observe your airspace. So we said, well, there's a 70-foot tower. What if we try flying from on there? It was awesome. You could see everything. You could see the airspace for 20 miles in every direction. It was sweet, but the problem is you can't launch and land from on top of a 70-foot tower unless it's remote. So what you can see here is this is where we're about 300 feet away probably, launching and landing our M600 from on top of this tower to control the aircraft. This second image is just cool. It's the actual 3DR Solo. We have a couple pilots and then a radio operator, part of the crew here sitting on the rim of the Grand Canyon. The remote pilot in charge is actually observing the UAS through FPV goggles right here. And this is really, FPV goggles are super useful and helpful when we're working in very bright environments like the desert of the Grand Canyon. And then just to bring it home a little bit, this is some DOI operators operating the ground control station where we're actually using the 3DR Solo hand controller to launch and monitor diagnostic information, but then using Mission Planner with a PC to actually control automated flight with the aircraft. Talked a lot about the human-machine interface. The only thing I want to point out here with this last image is this is the General Atomics Aeronautical Ground Control Station. And you can check out the link that talks right about this. They call this their advanced cockpit. But I mean, check out this thing, right? You talk about the 3DR Solo as a UAS ground control system, and then compare it to this thing, right? We got 1, 2, 3, we have 6 different computer monitors, the computer keyboard. You have the HOTAS control system here, which is comprised of like these 3 different hand controllers. A bunch of different interfaces, a bunch of different buttons. So this cockpit can actually be attached to several different large UAS, not just the Global Hawk, not just the Reaper or the other large UAS. It can be used to fly a host of different large UAS.